The marble floors of the Cook County Courthouse echoed under Elena Ramirez's heels as she walked toward courtroom 6B, each step deliberate. Outside, Chicago was buried under a slate-gray winter sky, the kind that pressed down on the city like a weight. Inside, the air was overheated, dry, and stale, scented faintly with old paper and cheap coffee. Elena had never imagined herself in this position, not like this. Not alone, she clutched a leather folder to her chest. Inside it the final will and testament of Daniel Ramirez, her husband of 27 years. A contract lawyer renowned for his clarity, precision, and a certain stubborn nobility, Daniel had drafted the document himself. Elena hadn't even known about the final clause until she'd gone through his files after the funeral. Now she stood in a courtroom, facing them, the lawyers from Danning and Finch, representing Corbridge Holdings, a powerful real estate conglomerate. They were after Daniel's modest but valuable property portfolio on the city's south side, arguing that a previous business agreement had transferred ownership rights upon his death. Elena knew better. Daniel had always been careful, especially when it came to contracts. Judge Raymond Kessler, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, adjusted his robe as he leaned forward. He hadn't looked at her once since she entered the room. "You may proceed, Mrs. Ramirez," he said flatly, not even trying to hide his impatience. Elena inhaled slowly. "Your Honor, before my husband died, let's keep this concise," the judge interrupted, waving a hand. "We've all read the affidavits. We're here to clarify, not dramatize." Elena's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I just want to explain why the clause in his final will." "Again," the judge said, cutting her off, "you're not a lawyer. You're the widow. Let's leave the legal interpretations to those qualified to do so." A quiet chuckle rose from the defense table. Elena's eyes flicked toward the lead attorney for Corbridge, Nicholas Vale. Slick hair, tailored suit, smug smile. He hadn't even glanced at her during the pretrial motions. To them, she wasn't a person, just an obstacle. "I am here," Elena said, her voice steady, "not to interpret the law, but to tell the court what my husband told me when he finalized his will." "I believe it's relevant, Mrs. Ramirez," the judge interrupted for the third time, his voice sharp now. "This is not a forum for emotional recollections." She felt the burn rise behind her eyes but kept her face neutral. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not now." She glanced at the folder in her hands. Inside was Daniel's final move, the clause he had buried at the end of the document, beneath the standard legalese. The one she hadn't mentioned yet. The one that changed everything. Kessler turned to the defense. "Mr. Vale, do you have a witness ready?" "We do, Your Honor," Vale said smoothly. "But I believe opposing counsel should finish her remarks. If she has anything of substance left." The courtroom tilted slightly as Elena steadied herself against the lectern. She could feel the heat of judgment crawling up her neck, not just from the judge or the defense but from the silent court spectators. Most were junior clerks or interns, bored and scrolling on their phones. But some, neighbors, maybe even one of Daniel's old clients, watched her with cautious hope. "I'll be brief," Elena said, ignoring the flicker of a smirk from Vale. Daniel believed in systems. In clarity. He didn't like surprises, not in his contracts, not in his life. And he certainly didn't trust Corbridge Holdings, especially after what they tried last year in back of the yards. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Allegations? Not facts, Mrs. Ramirez." "But his final clause is a fact," Elena said. "And when the court hears it, when I read it, you'll understand exactly what he was protecting." "That's quite enough," Judge Kessler snapped, interrupting her for the fifth time. "If you intend to testify, you'll wait your turn like everyone else." Elena bowed her head slightly. She didn't speak again. She would wait, let them underestimate her. Let them think she was just another grieving widow, fumbling with legalese she didn't understand. She'd waited through illness, through hospice, through the slow collapse of the man she loved. Waiting was nothing new. When her turn came, she would open the folder, read Daniel's final words aloud, and watch the foundation of their argument crumble. For now, she stood in silence, holding her ground in the storm. The courthouse cafeteria was a dimly lit room with flickering fluorescent lights and the sour smell of burnt coffee. Elena sat at a table near the vending machines, her untouched sandwich pushed to the side. Her folder lay open in front of her, pages fanned out like a slow-developing hand of cards. She traced her finger over the paragraph Daniel had left in the final clause. "In the event of any contestation from entities previously engaged in property negotiations, Clause 17.4 shall prevail, superseding all prior verbal or written agreements, unless countersigned by both parties with express revocation stated therein." It was elegant, precise, pure Daniel. A sentence built like steel. "Elena," a voice said gently. She looked up to see Thomas Chen, Daniel's former associate. Young, sharp, and idealistic, Thomas had worked under Daniel for 3 years before moving to a boutique law firm downtown. He was the only lawyer she trusted enough to even mention the will to. "I saw you in court," he said, slipping into the seat across from her. "Vale's a shark, and Judge Kessler, he's known for being dismissive, especially when a case isn't lucrative or high profile." Elena gave a tired smile. "He interrupted me 5 times, Thomas." 5. I counted. Thomas sighed. "They're trying to bury you in procedure. They know the will's strong, but if they can intimidate you or confuse the process, they win by default. Delay, discredit, dismantle. That's their strategy." "But Daniel anticipated them," she said, tapping the final page. "This clause nullifies their entire argument. If we can just get it into the record, we can," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "But you need to make it bulletproof. Vale's going to argue it's a late insertion or that it doesn't apply retroactively. You need to prove it was Daniel's original intent." "Was this clause notarized?" She nodded. "He had it notarized the week before he died. I found the documents in his safe." "That helps. A lot." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the vending machines buzzing between them. "Why didn't you go through a lawyer, Elena?" Thomas asked softly. She looked at him, eyes steady. "Because Daniel didn't leave this to lawyers. He left it to me. He said, you'll know when to use it. And you'll be strong enough to face them." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then you're going to need to be smarter than them. Not just strong." Elena took a breath and stood. "I'm ready." Back in courtroom 6B, the afternoon light was harsh through the high windows, slicing through dust motes and angled beams. Vale was on his feet now, grilling a former project manager from Corbridge who claimed Daniel had agreed to a handshake deal transferring property interests in exchange for future development funds. Elena's hands tightened around her folder. There was no deal, she thought. Daniel would never have agreed to something so sloppy, so legally vague. Every move he made was documented. The judge seemed indifferent, barely glancing up as the witness rambled about timelines and meetings and supposed agreements that were definitely understood. Elena leaned to Thomas. "How do they get away with this?" "They don't have to prove it," he whispered. "They just have to make it muddy enough that you can't prove otherwise." Then the moment came. "Mrs. Ramirez," Judge Kessler said, already sounding bored. "You may return to the stand. Please, this time, be direct." Elena walked to the front of the room, heels clicking with quiet certainty. She opened the folder. Took out the final page. Her voice was calm, clear, measured. "This is clause 17.4 from my husband's will," she began. "It is signed, notarized, and written in his own hand. It states that any previous agreement, unless explicitly revoked and countersigned, is null and void upon his death." She read the clause aloud, slowly, letting each syllable settle into the heavy silence of the courtroom. No interruptions. Not this time. Vale stirred at the defense table, frowning. The judge's head lifted a little. Thomas smiled, just slightly. When Elena finished reading, she looked up and said, "There was no countersigned agreement. There was no revocation. My husband never relinquished those properties. This clause protects them. And I am here to enforce it." The courtroom stayed quiet for several long seconds. Then, for the first time that day, Judge Kessler looked at her directly. Really looked at her, and for the first time, Nicholas Vale didn't smile. 3 days passed before the next hearing. Chicago was still in its winter grip, the wind off Lake Michigan slicing through coats like knives. Elena sat in her living room, wrapped in a thick cardigan, the folder open on the coffee table, now stuffed with more than just the will. There were emails, notes, contracts, and Daniel's personal journal, where he'd written about Corbridge's first approach. She hadn't wanted to read it at first. The leather-bound book felt sacred, a remnant of Daniel untouched by her grief. But Thomas had insisted, intent matters. If they try to argue ambiguity, we need evidence of what he believed and what he feared. On page 74, Daniel had written, "Corbridge doesn't want a partnership. They want to strip the south side of its soul and sell it in pieces. They offered money, smiles, promises. But it was always a land grab. I said no. That means they'll try something else." That sentence had hit Elena like a hammer. She circled it with a red pen and copied it, along with the date, onto a separate sheet. The morning of the hearing, Thomas picked her up in his car. He was unusually quiet as they drove down Michigan Avenue, the towers of glass and steel looming like silent judges. Elena kept her gaze fixed ahead, Vale's filing a motion to suppress the clause. Thomas finally said, "Suppress it?" Elena turned to him. "How?" "He's arguing that it's not a material part of the estate. That since it wasn't mentioned in the summary filed with probate, it's inadmissible unless refiled. He's also questioning the notary's credentials." Elena's lips tightened. "So they're going to pretend it doesn't exist. They're going to try." In courtroom 6B, the energy was different. Colder. Tighter. Judge Kessler looked annoyed before anyone even spoke. Vale stood with exaggerated composure. Your Honor, in light of new documents submitted by Mrs. Ramirez, we respectfully move to suppress Clause 17.4 on the grounds that it lacks a proper chain of documentation and was not disclosed during initial probate filing. Furthermore, we question the legitimacy of the notarization. He turned slightly toward Elena, eyes narrow. We are not suggesting fraud, of course. But clarity is essential in estate disputes. Thomas rose smoothly. Your Honor, the clause in question is not new. It has been part of the will since its final revision. The notary in question has already submitted a sworn affidavit verifying the date and presence of Mr. Ramirez. We also submit a page from the decedent's personal journal, which directly references the intentions behind the clause and his rejection of Corbridge's overtures. Kessler adjusted his glasses. A journal? Thomas handed over a copy. Vale snorted. We're entering diary entries now. It's a documented record of the decedent's thoughts and intent, Thomas replied. And given the contested nature of this clause, it is directly relevant. The judge read silently for a moment, flipping pages. Then, his voice flat, this court does not typically rely on personal journals for legal interpretation. But intent does matter. I'll allow it, for now. Vale didn't blink, but Elena saw his jaw flex. A crack in the armor. The judge turned to Elena. Do you have anything else, Mrs. Ramirez? She stood. Her palms were damp, her heart thudding. But her voice was firm. Yes, Your Honor. My husband was meticulous. He left everything organized, down to file names on his computer. I brought copies of the folder structure where the clause was stored, and the metadata showing when it was last modified. He labeled it, Final Revision, No Exceptions. That's what it meant to him. Vale objected. Metadata is easily altered, if you know how, Thomas interjected. Mrs. Ramirez does not. She's not a coder. She's not a lawyer. She's a widow honoring her husband's words, not manipulating them. The courtroom was silent again. Judge Kessler looked at Elena for a long time. Then he turned to the bailiff. Have the notary summoned for in-person testimony. We'll continue this line of inquiry at the next session. Until then, no further motions will be accepted without review. He banged the gavel. As the court emptied, Vale passed Elena without a word, his stride quicker than usual. Outside, the wind howled between the buildings. Elena stepped into it, head high, clutching the folder close. The paper trail Daniel had left behind was more than ink, it was armor, and for the first time since his death, she felt him there beside her. Not as memory, as presence. The notary's name was Jeanette Holloway, a retired paralegal who had once worked alongside Daniel in the early 2000s. She entered courtroom 6B in a soft gray coat and low-heeled shoes, her stride careful but sure. Her white hair was tied into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp, focused, scanned the courtroom like someone who had testified before. Elena sat in the front row with Thomas, a quiet tension in her chest. She hadn't seen Jeanette in years. Daniel used to call her a vault with legs, discreet, meticulous, incorruptible. She was exactly who he would have trusted for something like this. Judge Kessler leaned back as Jeanette took the stand. Ms. Holloway, you've submitted an affidavit confirming that Clause 17.4 was notarized in your presence. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor, Jeanette said clearly. Nicholas Vale stood. Ms. Holloway, you're aware this clause was not included in the summary filed during probate. Isn't that irregular? Jeanette didn't blink. It may be irregular, Mr. Vale, but it's not illegal. Not all clauses appear in summaries. Summaries are just that, summaries. Not comprehensive replications. Vale paced slightly, trying a new angle. Do you recall the date of notarization? March 19th, last year. That was 6 days before Mr. Ramirez passed away. Was he of sound mind? Jeanette nodded. He was weak. Physically. But lucid. He read me the clause out loud before signing it. Then he looked me in the eye and said, There. Going to come for this. Make sure it stands. A few murmurs rose in the courtroom. Vale stepped closer. You were a friend of the decedent? I was his colleague, Jeanette corrected him. And no matter what else you insinuate, I never mixed friendship with legal obligations. My logbook and my notary stamp are available for the court to examine. Vale opened his mouth, but the judge cut in. That won't be necessary. You've established the clause was properly notarized. Let's move on. Elena exhaled slowly. Thomas gave her a subtle nod, then the judge turned to the defense. Mr. Vale, you may proceed with your next witness. But Vale hesitated. We request a brief recess, Your Honor. Kessler's eyebrows lifted. You're the ones who pushed for urgency. Do you no longer wish to proceed? No, Your Honor. We're simply re-evaluating our approach given the court's acceptance of recent documents. Kessler waved him off. You'll get 20 minutes. Use them wisely. As the courtroom emptied again, Thomas leaned toward Elena. They're stalling. He didn't expect Jeanette to be that solid, she said. He expected her to fold, or to fumble. They're going to pivot now. Probably start attacking Daniel's mental capacity near the end. Elena closed the folder in her lap. Let them. Back in the courthouse hallway, Vale was on the phone, voice tight, pacing in front of the windows. Elena didn't try to hide when he glanced over. She held his gaze, steady. A moment later, he ended the call and approached her, off the record. He said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I imagine it was always going to be hard," she replied. "You're emotional." "Understandably. But that clause? It's not going to change the fact that your husband's properties were entangled in contracts. We have years of negotiation, history, paper trails, memos. And none of them countersigned or revoked the clause," Elena said. "I've read them. You know that." Vale's expression darkened. "You don't know what this kind of fight does to people." "I do," she said, stepping closer. "Because you're already unraveling." He stared at her for a long second. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Inside, the court reconvened. Judge Kessler called the session back to order and looked directly at Elena. "Mrs. Ramirez," he said, voice less impatient than before, "we'll resume testimony regarding property agreements next week. But I want to be clear, your husband's clause is now formally entered into the record." Elena nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Outside the courthouse, snow had begun to fall again, quiet and steady. Elena stepped out into it, face lifted slightly to the sky. She hadn't won yet, not even close. But something had shifted. Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. "They're going to come for this. Make sure it stands." She was making it stand. The snow hadn't let up by the following morning. Elena stood by the window of her kitchen, watching the city get swallowed by a white silence. The South Side, where she and Daniel had lived for 2 decades, looked almost peaceful under the blanket of frost. But she knew that peace was a fragile illusion. By noon, she was back at the courthouse, not in courtroom 6B, but in the basement records department. Thomas had asked her to meet a contact there, someone he vaguely referred to as useful. The man waiting for her wore a security badge and a faded corduroy blazer. His name tag read Robert L. Clerk Services. "You're Elena?" he asked, not looking up from the photocopier. "I am. I heard about your case. Ramirez, right? Daniel Ramirez?" "Yes." He nodded, hitting a button. "He helped my cousin out of a mess once. Pro bono. Told her to get her name off a bogus lease Corbridge was pushing. Saved her from getting evicted." Elena's mouth tightened. "I didn't know that." He didn't like to talk about favors. Just did them. He handed her a small stack of papers. "These are unofficial, okay? I can't be subpoenaed for this. But if your lawyer finds a legitimate way to introduce them, well, let's just say it might tilt the field." She looked down at the documents. Memos, timestamped emails, and internal correspondence from Corbridge Holdings dated nearly a year before Daniel's death. Several were between a junior analyst and a mid-level executive, referencing alternative pathways to acquisition if Ramirez refuses, and one message blatantly stated, "Legal contestation may be necessary. We've done it before." One thread was particularly damning. A draft memo had a heading that read, "Strategy for Posthumous Claim, Ramirez Assets." It was dated a full 6 months before Daniel had passed away. "They planned this," she whispered. Robert shrugged. "They always plan it. Most people just don't find the paper trail." Elena tucked the documents into her folder and looked at him. "Why help me?" He hesitated. Then he said simply, "Because people like Daniel are rare. And because people like Vale think they're untouchable." Back upstairs, Thomas nearly dropped his coffee when he saw what she had. "You got these from who?" "Let's just say an old favor came around." He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning with quick precision. "This isn't just useful. It's a window into intent, strategy, motive, everything. If we can authenticate the emails, we can bring them in as evidence of predatory legal planning. That changes how the judge views the whole narrative. And if we can't?" He looked at her. "Then we make noise. Because once this hits the record, the court has to respond." Back in courtroom 6B, Thomas approached the bench during a procedural break. "Your Honor," he said, placing a sealed manila envelope in front of Judge Kessler, "we'd like to submit a motion to review supplemental discovery materials obtained through an independent source. These documents speak to prior knowledge and potential intent to circumvent legal rights posthumously." Kessler raised an eyebrow. "Unverified?" "For now, yes," Thomas admitted. "But we are pursuing verification through IT subpoenas." Vale's voice cut in sharply. "This is irregular. Opposing counsel is presenting extrajudicial documents with no chain of custody. We're not introducing them as definitive proof, Thomas said, holding his ground. We're asking for the court's permission to verify them. Once verified, they become part of the evidentiary record. Judge Kessler took a long look at the envelope, then at Elena. Mrs. Ramirez, he said slowly, are you the origin of these documents? I was given them anonymously, Your Honor, she replied truthfully. But they speak to a broader pattern of behavior that supports my husband's final clause. Silence, then the judge leaned back. Motion to review is granted. You have 1 week to authenticate. Until then, these documents remain sealed and inadmissible in final argument. Vale's jaw visibly clenched. Elena didn't flinch. Later, as they walked down the courthouse steps, Thomas glanced sideways at her. You know what happens if those emails are real? She nodded. They didn't just try to steal property, she said. They mapped out how to do it before Daniel was even gone. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't have to. Elena looked up at the sky again, snow still falling, soft and steady. For the first time, she wasn't just standing her ground, she was advancing. The week that followed was a blur of signatures, sworn statements, and tech subpoenas. Thomas's firm hired a digital forensics specialist, a quiet, serious woman named Lila Reyes who wore all black and carried a tablet like a shield. She met Elena in Thomas's office on a gray Thursday morning. I've reviewed the metadata and header information from the documents you were given, Lila said, scrolling through her screen. They're clean. No signs of tampering. The emails trace back to Corbridge Holdings' internal servers. Elena felt the breath catch in her chest. You're sure? As sure as anyone in my position can be. These emails were created when they say they were created, on the accounts they say they came from. Which means Corbridge started planning how to contest Daniel's estate while he was still alive, and before any public knowledge of his illness. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We'll file today. With this, we're not just defending a clause anymore. We're exposing intent to defraud. Elena stared at the screen, at the tiny, factual timestamps that now carried the weight of truth. Daniel had known. Not the details, not the emails, but the shape of it. The way power worked. The way people like Vale and the executives at Corbridge operated in shadows and margins. By the time they arrived at the courthouse, Elena felt different. Not stronger, exactly, but more aligned. As if the gears of something larger were finally turning in the right direction. Inside courtroom 6B, Vale stood by the defense table, arms crossed, speaking low to his team. He looked up as Elena entered, and for a moment, their eyes locked. He knew Judge Kessler entered promptly at 10, gavel in hand. We'll begin with the matter of newly submitted evidence, he said, glancing at his docket. Mr. Chen? Thomas rose. Your Honor, we have completed forensic authentication of the documents submitted last week. Our expert is present and prepared to testify. The material confirms internal correspondence within Corbridge Holdings detailing an intent to pursue legal control over the Ramirez estate prior to Mr. Ramirez's death, an intent that, we argue, directly contradicts their claims of good faith. Negotiations. Kessler turned to Vale. Mr. Vale? Vale stood, his tone restrained. We object to the admissibility of these materials. Even if technically authentic, they represent strategic discussions, not binding decisions. Corporations discuss contingencies all the time. Kessler raised a hand. Noted. I'll hear from the expert. Lila Reyes approached the stand, her answers direct and precise. She walked the court through metadata verification, domain tracking, and timestamps. She showed that the email titled Posthumous Claim Strategy had been created on Corbridge's servers and forwarded to 6 senior executives, all before Daniel had entered hospice care. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Kessler looked down at the pages in front of him, his voice low. These communications, if accepted, indicate prior planning to assert claims over assets despite clear legal protections, potentially through contestation or legal ambiguity. He paused, tapping his pen against the desk. This court finds the material admissible. The documents are now entered into the evidentiary record. Vale remained stone-faced, but one of his junior attorneys shifted in their seat. Thomas turned to Elena and whispered, that was the wall coming down. The judge continued. This new information casts doubt on the defense's claims of legitimate expectation. Therefore, any previous assumptions regarding the estate's status are now subject to re-evaluation. We will reconvene in 3 days for final statements. Gavel down. Court adjourned. Outside, Elena leaned against a stone pillar, her breath clouding in the cold air. Thomas stood beside her, coat collar turned up against the wind. They can still appeal, he said. They can throw money at this until it's blue in the face. But now the court sees them, Elena replied. Not as a corporation protecting its interests, but as people trying to steal from the dead. She looked up at the gray sky. The sun finally breaking through in thin, golden lines. Daniel had written one clause. But he'd told a whole story in doing so, and now, that story was being heard. 3 days. That's all that separated Elena from a verdict. The courthouse had become familiar by now, its cold corridors, the grinding sound of old elevators, the smell of wet coats and ink. But today, as she stood in the hallway outside courtroom 6B, it felt different. Charged. The press had begun to take interest, with one local paper running a story titled, "Widow versus Developers, the Quiet Fight Over the South Side." Thomas stood beside her, flipping through his notes. He looked calm, but Elena had learned to read the tension in his shoulders. "Vale will go on offense today," he said. "Discredit the emails, minimize intent, paint Daniel's clause as paranoid. He'll be lying. Legally, he'll be reframing. But yes, he'll lie." The bailiff opened the doors, and the room filled quickly. For the first time since the hearings began, the public benches were packed. Some were neighbors, others students, and a few were Daniel's former clients. They nodded at Elena as she passed. Judge Kessler entered at 9:03 a.m., looking every bit the part of a man who hadn't slept well. He motioned for the room to sit. "Today we hear final statements. Counsel, proceed." Vale stood first. He walked slowly, hands clasped, voice smooth. "Your Honor, the defense acknowledges that certain internal communications have painted Corbridge Holdings in an unflattering light. But the law is not about optics. It's about agreements, what was signed, what was binding, and what can be proven." He turned to face the judge. "Yes, discussions were had internally. That is not uncommon. Corporations plan for all contingencies. But discussion is not action. Speculation is not fraud. We maintain that there was an understanding with Mr. Ramirez, an informal agreement to release certain property rights, which unfortunately were not formalized due to his passing." Elena clenched her jaw. Thomas didn't move. Vale continued. "Mrs. Ramirez is not a lawyer. Her reading of Clause 17.4 is, understandably, driven by grief. But the law does not yield to emotion. It follows structure, documentation, and precedent. And we submit that the structure does not support her claim." He sat down. Silence. Thomas rose, buttoned his jacket, and stepped forward. "Your Honor, the estate of Daniel Ramirez is not just a legal structure. It's a record of intent, ethics, and clarity. Mr. Ramirez didn't write vague contracts. He didn't leave open doors. He closed them, firmly and legally." He lifted a single sheet from his folder. "Clause 17.4 is not just legally valid, it is morally unambiguous. It says, in Daniel's own words, that unless a prior agreement was countersigned and explicitly revoked, it is null. That's the law, and that's his final wish." He looked directly at the judge. "We are not asking the court to interpret emotion. We are asking the court to read a sentence and respect its power. The defense had no signed agreement. Not obekastin. What they have are internal emails planning how to maneuver around a dead man's rights." Thomas let the words hang. Then, quieter, "And yet, Mrs. Ramirez stood here, dismissed, interrupted, told she didn't belong. But she stood, because the law isn't just for the powerful. It's for the precise. And Daniel Ramirez was nothing if not precise." He stepped back. The courtroom was so still that even the hum of the overhead lights felt loud. Judge Kessler looked at his docket, then at Elena. "This court will recess and return with a decision tomorrow at 10 a.m. Gavel down. As the crowd filtered out, Elena remained seated. Her hands rested on the folder. The one she had carried since day one. Inside it, Daniel's will. His clause. His truth. Tomorrow, she would learn if that truth was enough. The wind was sharp that morning. It cut through the layers of Elena's coat as she stepped out of the taxi in front of the courthouse. The sky was a brittle, pale blue, clear but cold, a sky that held its breath. She did the same inside, courtroom. 6B was nearly full before the judge even entered. Word had spread beyond local interest. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune sat 2 rows back, typing notes into her phone. A camera crew hovered outside, blocked from entering but angling for reactions. Once court adjourned, Elena took her seat, the same seat she had claimed since the first hearing. She placed her folder on her lap. The same one she had carried every day. She hadn't opened it this morning. Thomas arrived beside her, his suit crisp, eyes focused. "We did everything we could," he said. "I know," she replied quietly. "And Daniel did too." The courtroom doors opened. Judge Kessler entered, face unreadable, moving slower than usual. He took his seat and adjusted his glasses, glancing at the pages in front of him. The room fell into silence. "This court has reviewed all submitted materials," he began, his voice firm but low. "Including the authenticated emails, the notarized Clause 17.4, and both final arguments." He paused, folding his hands. What this case has made clear is that legal power does not always rest with the party best equipped, but often with the one most determined. Elena's hands tightened around the edge of her coat. The clause in question, 17.4 of the will of Daniel Ramirez, is legally sound, properly notarized, and consistent with the decedent's professional practice and personal documentation. Its intent is clear. Its wording is unambiguous. Vale sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the bench. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court finds that internal communications from Corebridge Holdings indicate an organized effort to identify and exploit legal vulnerabilities following Mr. Ramirez's death. These actions, while not illegal in and of themselves, present a troubling pattern of predatory legal behavior. He looked up, directly at Elena. Therefore, this court rules that clause 17.4 shall be upheld. All properties identified under the clause remain the legal property of the Ramirez estate, and no claim by Corebridge Holdings shall supersede that designation. A slow exhale left Elena's body before she realized she'd been holding her breath. The words felt surreal. Heavy. Real. Judge Kessler gavelled once, then stood. This court is adjourned. Chairs scraped the floor. Whispers buzzed like static. Vale stood, gathered his papers, and left without a word. His team followed, hurried, faces drawn. Thomas turned to Elena. You did it. No, she said, voice thick. We did. Daniel did. As she stepped into the hallway, the cameras were waiting. Someone called her name, asked for a comment. But she didn't stop. Not yet. She walked past the marble pillars, out into the wind, and onto the courthouse steps. There, she paused. Looked up at the sky, and for the first time since Daniel died, she felt not just sorrow, but release. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from finishing. A man had tried to protect his legacy. A woman had made sure he did. It had been 4 days since the verdict. Elena sat at her kitchen table, Daniel's favorite coffee mug in her hands, the morning light stretching across the floor in quiet patterns. The apartment was calm in a way it hadn't been in weeks. The folder was no longer beside her, it now rested, unopened, in the drawer beneath the table. She didn't need to carry it anymore, but peace, she was learning, wasn't the same as silence. The phone rang. She answered on the second ring. Hello? Elena Ramirez, a voice asked, unfamiliar but smooth. Yes. My name is Olivia Trent. I represent the Strategic Acquisitions Division at Corebridge Holdings. I'm reaching out today with an offer we'd like you to consider. Elena's body stiffened. She stood slowly, as if bracing herself. You've got a lot of nerve, she said flatly. I understand how this sounds, Olivia replied, her tone even. But I'm not calling to reopen the case. What's done is done. We respect the court's decision. Elena didn't respond. Olivia continued. Our division is aware that you now hold full ownership of 11 properties on the south side. Several of these lots fall within our ongoing redevelopment zone. We're prepared to offer a direct buyout, above market rate. Substantial, and unconditional. Elena paced slowly across the kitchen. Why? Because, Olivia said, despite our disagreements, your husband was correct. Those lots are crucial. And now they're yours. We'd rather partner than fight. Elena laughed once. A sharp, dry sound. You spent 6 months trying to bury me in court. And now you want a partnership. I wasn't part of that strategy, Olivia said. Frankly, it was handled poorly. But we're in a new phase now. We'd like to start fresh. Elena stared out the window at the street below. Snow was melting in patches, leaving behind gray slush and exposed pavement. A city re-emerging. I'm not selling, she said. There was a pause. Elena, Olivia said gently, this is a significant opportunity. You could step away from all of this. Secure your future. Maybe even expand your reach. No pressure, of course. Just consider it. I have considered it, Elena replied. Every night since the verdict. And the answer is still no. She ended the call. Later that day, she met Thomas for lunch. They sat in a small cafe off 18th Street, a quiet place where the world felt less sharp. They offered, he asked, stirring his tea. Above market rate, she said. Unconditional. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Tempted? I was, she admitted. For a moment. Then I thought about what Daniel wrote in that journal. They want to strip the south side of its soul. Thomas nodded. So what now? I hold the properties, Elena said. I manage them. Maybe I renovate. Maybe I work with community developers. But I don't sell to the people who tried to steal them. She paused. And I don't disappear. Thomas smiled. I think Daniel would have liked that. I think he planned for it, she said. He didn't just leave me something to protect. He left me something to build. Outside, the wind had calmed. The streets bustled again, children running home from school, buses weaving through. Traffic, the south side moving as it always had. Not waiting for anyone, Elena no longer needed to fight for Daniel's voice to be heard. Now, it was her own voice that mattered, and she wasn't done speaking yet. The building on 47th and Wood was the first Elena visited after the verdict. It wasn't the largest in the portfolio, nor the most valuable. But it had been Daniel's favorite, a 2-story brick storefront with apartments above, tucked into a neighborhood where people still nodded to each other on the street. The lease had expired on the first floor months ago. The windows were dark, the "For Rent" sign curling at the edges. She unlocked the door with a slight tremble in her fingers. It was the first time she'd used the key since his death. Inside, the space was dusty, but intact. Wooden floors. High ceilings. A long-forgotten coffee grinder still sat on the counter. The shop had once been a cafe, a place where neighbors gathered before work. Daniel used to bring her there on Saturdays, just to sit and listen. She stood there for a while. In the quiet, then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Hi, it's Elena Ramirez. I'd like to talk to someone about small business grants for community-based tenants. I have a property I'd like to reopen, something useful, something local." That afternoon, she visited 2 more buildings. One needed a new roof. The other, foundation repairs. Problems that once would have felt overwhelming now felt like puzzles, something to solve, not suffer. The next week, she met with Ms. Alvarez, a community organizer who had been fighting displacement efforts in the area for years. They sat in the back of a crowded diner over black coffee and notes scribbled on napkins. "You really want to work with us?" Ms. Alvarez asked skeptically. "I don't want to sell these buildings to a company that planned my husband's erasure before he died," Elena said. "I want to make them useful. And I want help doing it right." Ms. Alvarez studied her. Then she smiled. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk tenants. Let's talk grants. Let's talk staying power." Word began to spread, slowly, not about the courtroom or the will, but about Elena's calls. About her visits. About a woman who had inherited a fight and decided not to walk away after winning. One day, a young woman named Brianna stopped Elena outside one of the properties. "You're the widow, right?" she asked. "From the trial?" Elena nodded. "I am. My mom said your husband helped save our building." She cried when she read about the verdict. Elena felt something tighten in her throat. "Thank you." Brianna hesitated. "I'm starting a food truck. Trying to find space to prep. Cheap space. Just thought, I don't know, maybe, come to the cafe on 47th, Elena said. "Next Tuesday. We'll talk." It wasn't a foundation yet. But it was beginning. Thomas stopped by her apartment that evening with a bottle of wine and a thick envelope. "What's this?" Elena asked. "The final legal discharge from probate," he said. "You're officially the estate's sole executor. No more challenges. No more motions." She opened the envelope and skimmed the pages. At the bottom, Daniel's name appeared. In bold. Beneath it, her own signature, dated that very morning. "You're a property owner," Thomas said. "And a landlord. And maybe a builder, if you're bold." Elena smiled. "Daniel always said I wasn't bold enough." "Then he underestimated you." She looked around her apartment. At the old photo of Daniel near the bookshelf, at the coat she wore to court still hanging by the door. "No," she said softly. "I think he saw all of this before I did. That's why he left it to me." Outside, the city moved in its rhythm. Trains. Footsteps. Wind, and beneath it all, the ground Daniel had protected, and the ground Elena was starting to reclaim, one decision at a time. Spring arrived without ceremony, as it often does in Chicago, suddenly, almost reluctantly. The last patches of dirty snow dissolved into puddles that reflected trees beginning to bud. On 47th Street, scaffolding now wrapped around the cafe building. Fresh boards replaced the warped ones, and a local muralist had started sketching on the brick exterior, a wide, colorful image of a South Side block alive with neighbors, children, and sunlight. Elena stood across the street, arms folded, watching the progress. Her coat was open for the first time in months. Beside her, Brianna stood with a clipboard, pointing at the cafe's interior through the window. "If the plumbing inspection clears next week, we can start the kitchen install," Brianna said. "My cousin's designing the layout. She's good with small spaces." Elena nodded. "Let's keep the front counter open. Daniel liked seeing everyone when he came in." Brianna smiled. "You talk about him like he's still here." Elena looked at the building again. "Sometimes he feels like he is." That afternoon, Elena met with Ms. Alvarez and 2 local grant organizers in what used to be a laundromat on 51st. It was being converted into a co-op space, part retail, part meeting hall, part legal clinic. Thomas had drawn up the lease himself. 10 years, rent-free. "We'll need permits," Ms. Alvarez said, flipping through a stack of forms. "We'll get them," Elena said. "There'll be resistance." I'm used to that. Ms. Alvarez smiled. You're not what they expected. No, Elena replied. But I'm exactly what Daniel planned for. At home that evening, Elena found herself staring at the worn copy of Daniel's will. It was no longer the center of her life, but she hadn't moved it. It still sat in the drawer beneath the table, still labeled, still whole. She opened it and turned again to clause 17.4. It was just a paragraph. 1 page. But it had carried the weight of a man's foresight and a woman's willpower. Her phone buzzed. It was Thomas. Mayor's office reached out. They want to meet you. Someone from Housing Redevelopment. She stared at the message for a long time before replying, fine. Let them come to the cafe next week. I'm not dressing up the next morning. She met Jeanette Holloway outside the courthouse. They shared a long hug, and Jeanette handed her a manila envelope. Letters, Jeanette said. From people Daniel worked with. Some of them wrote after the verdict. Thought you should have them. Elena took the envelope, her voice catching. Thank you. They sat on a bench just outside the entrance, watching as people flowed in and out, lawyers, clerks, defendants, witnesses. Some anxious, others bored. But all of them walking into rooms where they'd be asked to speak and prove and argue. Some of them, like her, not expecting to be heard. You remember the first time the judge cut me off? Elena asked. Jeanette chuckled. I thought you were going to storm out. I wanted to, Elena said. But Daniel once told me, you don't need to win the first sentence. Just the last one. Jeanette smiled. Well, you did that. The two women sat in silence a moment longer, then Elena stood. I should go, she said. I have a plumbing inspection. You're becoming quite the developer, Jeanette teased. I'm becoming something, Elena said. I'm still figuring out the name. She walked away, envelope in hand, heels steady on the courthouse steps. The same steps where, weeks before, she had waited for a verdict. Now, she wasn't waiting anymore, she was building. The soft hum of conversation filled the cafe. It was opening day, not a grand opening, no ribbon cutting or camera crews. Just neighbors, coffee, sunlight, and a space that felt like it belonged to the street again. Children laughed near the mural outside, and the scent of roasted beans and warm bread drifted through the air. Elena stood behind the counter in a simple blouse and jeans, her sleeves rolled up. Brianna was managing the espresso machine, her cousin plating pastries, and Ms. Alvarez sat in the back, preparing for a community planning meeting later that day. Every table was full. The city official from the mayor's office arrived quietly, without entourage or fanfare. A woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a folder in hand. Elena met her with a nod. Welcome to 47th, she said. The official smiled. We've been hearing a lot about what you're doing. Community first property use. Grant supported. Retail. Long-term affordability clauses. Elena nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. It's not flashy. But it works. The woman gestured toward the folder. We'd like to feature your model in the city's redevelopment toolkit. Possibly even replicate it. With your permission, of course. Elena didn't reply right away. She looked around the cafe instead, at the mother showing her daughter how to stir hot chocolate, at the two elderly men arguing about baseball stats, at the young man with headphones sketching quietly in a corner. I didn't do all this to be an example, she said finally. I know, the official replied. But sometimes the right example changes everything. Later, as the sun dipped toward the west, Elena walked to the back office and closed the door behind her. She sat down at the desk, the old one she and Daniel had shared in their apartment, and opened the manila envelope Jeanette had given her. Inside were letters. Some handwritten, others typed. All of them stories. Daniel helped us rewrite a lease after my landlord doubled the rent. He stayed after hours to explain a contract I didn't understand. He told me I had a right to fight. And then he showed me how. Elena read each one slowly, some twice. Tears came and went without urgency. They weren't heavy anymore. Just true. She pulled a pen from the drawer and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote, to those who feel outnumbered in a room or unheard beneath a robe, keep speaking. Even when they interrupt. Especially when they interrupt. Below it, she signed her name. That night, after the cafe closed and the lights dimmed, Elena locked the door and stepped out into the street. The mural caught the last orange glow of the sunset, the faces painted there lit as if alive. She walked past the buildings she now owned, not as trophies, but as tools. Not to be flipped or sold, but to be handed over, shared, and filled. At the corner of 51st, she stopped. The co-op clinic was opening in a week. Across the street, two teenagers were sweeping the sidewalk in front of a record shop being revived. By a grant Elena had co-signed. She watched them for a moment, unseen. Then she turned home. There was no more folder to carry. No court date on the calendar. No clause to prove, only her name, her choices, her steps, and this, her voice, uninterrupted.